You in the past have warned about an education catastrophe as a result of this push into remote learning. In your view, did the catastrophe happen or did we dodge it?
So we've dodged certain aspects of it. So the data that we do have that came out, especially last fall, when some kids got to some form of assessment, is that for certain groups, the learning loss has not been as significant. But the big asterisk on all of those assessments is that there's about 10 or 15% of the kids who didn't even show up for the assessment. And everyone suspects that those are the 10 or 15% of the kids who have suffered the most. So I still hold by the fact that this is going to have to be disaster recovery. The very fact that even of the 85% we were able to measure, we saw degradation by about 10, 15%. And then that 15%, they've literally fallen off the radar. And so when we get back to some form of normalcy, we're going to have to do a lot to make sure that their gaps don't stick with them forever.
So, do you think the learning gap ultimately will close, or is it only going to get wider over time?
Well, the hope is it does not get wider over the time, but there's been an interesting phenomenon where I think for a lot of families, because of the constraints of COVID, they've actually discovered new things that work well for them or work well for their children, where they're like, look, there's some really great things that are happening in the physical school setting, but I could go on Khan Academy. I could go on schoolhouse.world, which is another not-for-profit I recently started up to give free tutoring. There's other resources that you might be able to do, pod schooling, where for some kids, they're getting even more personalization and their learning is even accelerating. There's actually evidence of that too, that the distance learning has accelerated certain kids. And so that creates a fear of, just as everyone's talking these days about, hey, is technology going to accelerate the economic gap? Is it also going to be a situation on the learning side? Now, we think what we're going to see is for those who do have access to technology, it's actually going to close. And there's, as we know, there's a lot of folks in the bottom half of income earners, even the bottom quartile, who do have reasonable access, at least a cell phone. But then for those who aren't in a position to leverage it or aren't given the context to leverage it, I think the gaps might grow.
Now, Khan Academy has obviously been a huge support for so many kids, and as a parent, I'm super grateful. You've seen huge growth. What trends are you seeing now as schools start to reopen, if slowly?
So one of the fascinating trends we saw, we've talked a lot about almost a year ago when the closure started happening, we saw our traffic go by a factor of 3. And in 2020, we saw 12 billion learning minutes on Khan Academy, half of which was teacher directed, half of it which is students on their own. And that's a record for us. So 2020 definitely hit that. But what we're seeing is there's overall systemically less learning time going on. When we talk to some of the large districts or large charter networks, they've been talking to us about, we don't think we have enough class time to cover everything in calculus, to cover everything in algebra, to cover everything in chemistry. So now they're leaning on resources like Khan Academy and resources like schoolhouse.world to make sure that their students are able to have the exposure, because the total amount of learning time in the whole system seems to have gone down.
So there is still a lot of uncertainty, Sal, about what happens in the fall, given that children likely won't be vaccinated. We won't have a vaccine for kids by then. If we don't have one, do you think schools should still reopen in the fall?
I feel pretty strongly that they should. There's very little evidence of child-to-child transmission. There's been several school districts. The state of Rhode Island famously never shut down. They just took precautions, and this was obviously pre-vaccine, and they have no cases of child-to-child transmission in the state of Rhode Island. And this is a state commissioner that I know well, and we've worked closely with well. And so if that worked even pre-vaccine, I personally believe, and my wife's a physician, we talk a lot about this. I've even taught a little bit of immunology on Khan Academy. Once the adults are vaccinated, and maybe some of the older teenage level students, the risk of young child to child spread, especially if people are still taking precautions like wearing masks, or there's a little bit of distance, or you're leveraging outside, I think the potential risks are at that point lower than you would have from other illnesses like the flu, and the potential harm of not going to school, which is significant. We're seeing anxiety, depression, social emotional skills really suffering right now. That's going to turn into the epidemic if we don't get the kids back to school.
Moderna recently released some new information about the studies that they're doing on children. We're getting more detail on the Pfizer pediatric trials as well. That said, some parents might not feel comfortable sending their kids back to school. And I wonder what your biggest concerns are in that situation. Inevitably, some kids, I would think, aren't going to go back.
Yeah, I think it's just got to be a lot of education about this, because once all of the adults are vaccinated, and frankly, once the parents are vaccinated, especially if we're talking about younger children, if we're talking about under the age of 12, there's almost no evidence of child to child spread. Once again, especially if all the adults are vaccinated. And then even we know, there's some horrible stories we hear every now and then about a young child who gets COVID with bad outcomes. But those are still few and far between relative to other things like the flu, which kills thousands of kids every year. So I think we just have to have education about putting everything in perspective, because it's easy to hear a few horror stories on the news that highlight these 1 in a million cases, but the real odds are very safe from a COVID point of view, and the mental health and the harm to your education that the children will suffer is a far bigger risk.
Now, this is another interesting trend. We spoke to Melinda Gates, who's really concerned about women backsliding in the pandemic, and we found that more women are dropping out of the workforce where there are more kids in remote school. So if women have lost their jobs or they've left their jobs, you wonder if they might feel more flexibility to keep their kids at home, whether or not it's a good thing. What do you think about that?
Well, there's definitely that movement, and I do think this has been an unfortunate trend where as the families have had to take on more of the childcare responsibilities and keeping the kids up with schools, it has fallen disproportionately on the women in the families, which is really hard on their careers and all the rest. But this trend of some families actually discovering during the pandemic that certain aspects of pandemic schooling were actually working well for their children, I think is going to continue. I talked to the state commissioner of Alaska, which you can imagine already had a large homeschooling population because of their geography and access to schools. They've seen their homeschoolers go from 10% to 25% of the state. So it's not a niche thing in their state. And they don't think it's going to go back to 10%. They think it's going to maybe go back to 20%. But all of a sudden, pod schooling, homeschooling, or some hybrid between normal schooling, traditional schooling, and homeschooling, pod schooling, I think is going to become more and more the norm.
Meantime, the stimulus bill, $170 billion to help schools, though schools might be facing some pressure to use that quickly. How much will that help? How are you expecting that money to have an impact?
Yeah, this is the hot topic these days. I'm actually have a meeting with a bunch of state education leaders and district leaders tomorrow to discuss this exact same thing, because behind closed doors, everyone is both very excited. They're like, wow, $120 billion, 20% of which is for learning loss. I mean, billions and billions of dollars. But behind closed doors, they're like, we're going to have a lot of pressure to put it to work fast, to do stuff by this summer, to do it by back to school. But they're afraid that if it's not well thought out, this money could easily disappear as large as it is. And then obviously if it disappears, then people will be skeptical the next time. Now, the things that people are talking about, high quality, high intervention, high dosage tutoring.
Okay.
That's something that we're hoping to do through schoolhouse.world, where anyone can go right now and either volunteer to be a tutor or get free tutoring for their children. But this is free. We don't charge people for this. So I'm like, maybe we should have gotten into that pool of money. Khan Academy, a lot of people view that as part of the formula. As we are free. We do a district offering where the districts get support and training, and that takes some resources. But yeah, I think it is a big question mark of how do you put that degree of capital to work so it has maximum impact, and also if it has positive impact, how it can last well beyond COVID.